One person's journey could leave many footprints. Hey, and welcome back to Crime Over Cocktails. I am Tiffany, your host, and today I have guest Lyn Barrett. Well, I'm so happy to have you on the show. I find this very interesting.
Thank you, Tiffany. I'm really happy to be here.
So, and you are a trauma survivor.
That is very true, yes. So in 1992, when I would have been about 45, actually, I can't do the math, but I think that's about right. I was diagnosed with multiple personality disorder, or what was known then as MPD. And then several years later, that diagnosis was changed to dissociative identity disorder, or DID. So I have multiple parts and did not know it. And they were formed when I was a very small child. And so the way we understand dissociative identity disorder, it begins with the concept of dissociation. And I'll tell you a little bit about that first, and then tell you more about the disorder itself. But dissociation is actually a very normal function of the body-mind. It means that the body and the mind temporarily separate, and we all do it. So when boredom is one of the prompts for dissociation. So I like to use the example of sitting in a lecture hall, listening to your professor drone on and on and on. But you're by the window and you look out the window and there's kids playing soccer. And man, you're out there with the kids playing soccer and you have left that professor back in the lecture hall because your mind separates from your body and goes there with those kids just for a few minutes and then comes back again. And you're really just sitting there. But we do that. That's
I do that a lot.
Basic form of dissociation. Yeah. Another reason for dissociation could be protection. So boredom is one, protection is another. And so we are starting to raise the stakes of the game. And people, a soldier on the battlefield may dissociate the horrors that he's witnessing or participating in. A woman who is being raped may dissociate what's being done to her so she can manage the horror better. So when we dissociate, it limits the impact of what's happening on us. But then we go back into the real world and we carry that dissociation with us. So people who have PTSD, soldiers and rape victims and other victims of violence have PTSD. Dissociation is often a key symptom of PTSD. Now, when we elevate it even higher, maybe that's not quite the right word for it, but the stakes get even higher, is when the trauma that someone is experiencing is, first of all, chronic. It happens over and over again. And secondly, it is happening to a small child. When those two factors are both present, then there's the possibility that the child will protect themselves by dissociating from what's happening. And then because the child's mind is not fully formed, that awareness, that memory gets locked into one part of the child's mind and not another part of the child's mind. So that means some of the child may be aware of abuse or trauma that's happening, and some of the child may not be aware of it. This is actually a very functional thing for the child, because often the perpetrator of the trauma may be someone in the child's circle of people that they rely on. So children are pretty dependent. We can't take care of ourselves. We have to rely on the grown-ups around us. So if one of the grown-ups around us is traumatizing us, then it's functional for us, for a part of us not to know that's happening. So the rest of us can go back out there and trust that person, because we need that person for food and for clothing and for shelter, and for protection from other things, if not for the events that they're perpetrating. So this is what happens, and the memories may go into many different parts, or they may just go into 2 or 3 different parts. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for the American Psychiatric Association requires that there be at least 2 or more fully formed parts. And there are people who have upwards of 100 parts or more, and then everything in between. In my particular case, I probably had somewhere around 25 parts. People with DID call their parts different things. So I'm calling them parts right now. Sometimes I might call them alters. I might call them insiders. Some people call them headmates. Some people call them persons. It's another person inside of me. So you might hear someone speaking of any of those particular designations for the different parts of us.
So I was reading the book a little bit, and I only got like about halfway through, but I'm going to finish it. I love it. It's such a good book, very well written.
Well, thank you. It was my first attempt at writing this kind of writing. I'm happy to hear when people tell me that it's really interesting to them and readable, and something that they really want to go back to. It's a page turner, I think some people have called it.
No, absolutely. Especially like when you're talking about the thoughts in your head, it sounds like me. You can actually like see yourself doing these things.
Yes.
And it almost brings you together. And that's what's so cool about it. If I read it correctly, you didn't notice until you were 35?
Yeah, I think that I can actually identify times when I was younger, when my system was leaking, so to speak. But of course, at those times, I had no idea what was happening. I would say that around 35 is when I really started to decompensate. And that's the psychological term that describes what happens when we start to lose all of our coping mechanisms. And at the time, I was a mother of 4 children, a wife. I thought I was in a really happy marriage, and I actually had just started to do a little bit of teaching in preschool. So at that time, I thought I had the perfect life, and that perfect life started very slowly but surely having holes punched in it. And I didn't know what was happening. But yes, that started at around the age of 35.
Wow. Yeah, I read the part about your husband. What made you out of the blue just ask that question? Was it like an intuition?
Well, the question that I asked my husband was, have you ever had an affair? And I had never consciously imagined that he would have an affair. So I asked myself the same question that you're asking me, is why in the world would I ask that question? Yet I didn't know that answer. I can only say now that I had many different parts of myself that were not aware of the other parts. And one part really thought, yeah, ask that question, boom, pushed it out, I asked my question if he had ever had an affair, and he said yes. And I said, how long? And he said, I said, when? He said, now. And I said, how long? And he said, 2 years. And it was like, boom. Okay. That just sort of shocked me out of depression, pushed me along the road of trying to uncover and discover what else was going on. Now, what I would like to explain very carefully is that my husband's affair and the really ugly divorce that we had was traumatic in its own right, but it did not cause the trauma that I had experienced as a small child. What it did was that trauma opened up the other trauma and enabled me to discover what had happened back then. So I don't want to blame my ex-husband and his philandering on what had happened to me. It certainly didn't help me in my own healing journey. But that was not the cause of it, but it certainly did open me up to discovering the crazy things that had been going on in my life when I was a small child.
Right. I think part of it might have to do because you said you thought you were dating somebody completely different from your father, but in reality, he really wasn't that different.
Well, people come in they come disguised in all kinds of ways,
Oh,
and
yeah.
you may have my father and my ex-husband became best of friends. Ex-husband inherited a large part of the estate that I should have inherited. When I say large part of the estate, my father was not wealthy, but he did have a good deal of assets when he died. So I was disowned. And so it was, it was very ugly.
When I first started reading the book, Sybil popped into my head. And I was like, oh, okay. Like, I totally get this.
Yeah, Sybil is one of the first stories of DID that came to light. Before that were the Three Faces of Eve. There's a number of books out there now by either by or about people with that disorder. There's been some controversy about Sybil because it was written by a journalist, and there's been criticism of the psychiatrist that Sybil had was too involved, and that some of this may not be true, and it's been debunked and all that. And for whatever reason, there seems to be an ongoing desire to debunk DID. And I have no idea whether the Sybil story is true or not. However, when I read it, it resonated with me. It really made sense to me. It touched on tuning forks inside of me that said, yep, I get that. I understand that. But that's her story. It's not mine. My story, I think, what makes it a little bit unique among the various stories or books that are put out about DID, it's a happy ending story. It is that I ultimately integrated my parts, and that doesn't mean my parts are not there; they still are. But they have pretty much relegated control or relinquished control of who I am to me, because they decided that life would be better if we operated as one rather than many. And so I think that and I have created a very fulfilling and happy life. I am 20 years beyond integration. I'm 75 years old. And I can do what I'm doing right now because I have nothing to risk because I'm retired. Most people with DID would not do that, quite understandably, because there is still so much stigma around the disorder, and people can lose jobs and they can lose friends by disclosing. So I have taken my position as a retired woman who doesn't have to worry about that anymore, and come out of the closet for my sake, in a sense, because it enables me to fully be who I am. But it's also for others because because others can't speak, and so I am speaking for many others who have DID but can't come out of the closet for that reason. That's not to suggest that how DID manifests in me is exactly the same as how it manifests in other people, because that's not true. It can manifest in many different ways. But the fact that we all share the same diagnosis is what prompts me to speak for others in a general sense, that we represent the whole segment of demographic populations. Some of us are very are average kind of folks. Some of us are brilliant, and yet because of the difficulties of this disorder, we may be on public assistance. We have people who are very creative. I lead writers' workshops for people with DID. We have musicians, writers, artists. We have psychotherapists with DID, absolutely. We have people with in all kinds of trades and professions who have DID. So, and of every ethnicity and race and gender identification. So, it doesn't so much have to do with whether you're poor or you're wealthy. In fact, it doesn't have anything to do with that. It has to do with what happened to you. And that can happen at that happens behind closed doors anywhere. Yeah.
Right. Happens more than people think. And people don't realize that has everlasting effects. That stays with you.
Definitely. They don't realize. I think I wish I understood that better, because child abuse is really endemic in our country, and we don't believe it, and we don't want to believe it. But the fact that we don't believe it actually enables perpetrators, because they know they can get away with it, and that no one will challenge them on that. So that's a whole nother topic, really, and it's not the one I normally talk about. At some point, if you ever want to have those conversations, I recommend Safe Communities, which is an organization that helps to build communities that will prevent child abuse. So I think that's good to know about that.
No, absolutely. So what are some of the symptoms of DID?
Yes. Okay. Well, I can tell you my symptoms in particular, and then place it in the larger context. So you mentioned that it started at the age of 35 for me. And I want to say that from the age of 35 to 45 years old, that 10-year period, I slowly began to decompensate to the point that I attempted suicide, and then 2 years later, checked myself into a psychiatric ward. So I started to have sort of racing thoughts, different streams of thinking going on at the same time. I had intense body pain everywhere, and sometimes someplace in specific, but often just everywhere. And I would jump into bed, or I'd roll into bed into a fetal position because I could barely move. I didn't feel like I was me. I often felt like I had left my body and was perched up in the corner of the room looking down on myself. And so I didn't identify with me. There were parts of that, the person I thought I was, some of that disappeared. Like I didn't know how to do things that I used to know how to do. And it's very, very disorienting. And because of that, my home life was deteriorating. And I had 4 children. In the book, I only have 3 because I was changing things to protect privacy. But I lost my ability to be a good mother. I didn't remember how to do that. And so it was just that created, of course, ruptures in attachment, my bonding and my attachment with my kids.
Oh, for sure.
And so it was very confusing for me. I did not understand what was happening. I began to have suicidal ideation all the time. I felt like the world would be a better place if I didn't live in it. And I didn't think I could really even manage for one more day. So amnesia is one of the required elements of dissociative identity disorder, and that can present itself in a variety of ways. Like you can actually lose time and not remember what happened yesterday. You don't even, the last thing you remember happened a week ago. My amnesia wasn't really quite like that. My amnesia was having amnesia for large segments of time. So I couldn't remember anything that happened to me in my childhood, and then I also had amnesia between my parts. So I didn't know, one part didn't know that another exists, didn't know that another exists, didn't know that another exists. So I kind of thought I was one person, but I wasn't. I was all these other people too. So that's the general landscape of DID. There's many other kinds of symptoms I'm sure that many people have. So we might present as having depression. We might present as having anxiety. But what I discovered is that antidepressants didn't work. And when I finally found a therapist who really understood what was happening to me, she said, "This isn't depression, Lyn. This is something, this is another part of you who's creating this feeling inside of you." And so there again, when I found the therapist who knew how to work with these kinds of situations, I began to make really good progress. I mean, not fast progress, but it was, I finally was able to start to understand what was happening to me. So when you have different parts come up and say these crazy things to you, it's like, who the heck am I? I mean, and you start to think you're crazy. And that's why I called the memoir that I've written is called Crazy: Reclaiming Life from the Shadow of Traumatic Memory. I want to say this, not just for myself, but for other people with DID, is that even though I entitled the book Crazy, I was not crazy and you are not crazy either. What we are is that we often feel crazy because of the crazy things that were done to us. And that's why I also said I reclaimed life from this traumatic memory that was just following me around. Let me talk to you about traumatic memory a little bit, because so we all know that memory is unreliable for all of us. Certainly for a 3-year-old, she's going to have unreliable memory, right? So nobody disagrees or doubts with that. But there's been a huge amount of research on trauma in the past 30 years. And what we have discovered is that traumatic memory doesn't reside in the front brain where most of our normal narrative memory goes. Traumatic memory goes into the body, and the body stores it. You may have heart palpitations. You may have nausea. You may have body memory or bodily memory that makes you unable to walk or move. There are a whole variety of body symptoms that are where the event that happened went. Rather than going into your narrative brain, it went into your back brain, which sends it back out into the body for storing. And if people are interested in learning more about that, the book that I recommend is The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, who a psychiatrist at Harvard University and Trauma Center. And he really has become the expert in that field, but he's trained many other people who have gone on and done research on their own. And so it's very interesting, because then, so we may have, we get snippets of narrative memory. We get little fragments of narrative memory, but we get whole bodies full of this traumatic memory, which is not the kind of memory that you can take into the courtroom. It's not the kind of memory you can take to the bank, but it is the kind of memory that you can work with and heal from, and find new life on the other side of it.
I don't remember half of my childhood. And my mom gets so like offended by that. But I'm like, I'm sorry. Like if she didn't have certain photos of me doing certain things, I tell you I didn't do.
Sure, sure. And so a lot of that is normal because we can only remember so much. But for those of us who have been traumatized, and I don't know if you were or not, that can take on a much larger, space of our memory. When I went through this 10 years of decompensation, that was, you're probably too young to even know about these things, but Polaroid cameras were all the rage. And
I know a Polaroid.
Pardon me?
Know a Polaroid.
Oh, cool. Okay. So Polaroid. So I had I was poor, but I saved my money to get a Polaroid camera so I could take pictures. And I have all these little albums of things that happened to me, mostly good things actually, because I was trying to like get myself together then. But so because I knew I couldn't remember anything before then, and so I wanted to start remembering my life. So I would take pictures of things and make little albums. And when you have Polaroids, and you can put, put a little, take a little Bic marker and label it and put it in your album. So it helped me to remember what was happening in my life because I couldn't remember anything before that.
I mean, I bet it was useful. And then you have all these memories for later on.
I do. That has really helped me so much, to be able to, well, it helps anybody. We all need a narrative. We all need to have a story. We want to know our story. And when we have these huge gaps, it is very disorienting, and it can lead to despair. So people, I'm really very fortunate. I worked really hard. I had a wonderful therapist who worked with me, and we can talk a little bit about treatment if you want to in a minute. But I actually, so people, and I'm a retired school teacher, retired pastor, a retired school teacher, retired principal, and retired pastor. So I've had 3 different careers sort of in my life, and people can listen to me and think, oh, well, that's not so difficult. She's really doing great. And I want to say, on the one hand, absolutely, to hold that hope out for others who are suffering from DID. But I also want to say I can't even begin to tell you the pain that we experience. It is overwhelming. It is constant pain. And voices in our heads telling us that we are unworthy, that we're wimps, that we need to die, and life is so hard. We may be able to manage in a professional place, but then we go home and we just fall apart. We can't do anything. And so I want your listeners to have a sense of that even though I am articulate and doing really well now, that it wasn't always that way, and that people with DID are really suffering until they're in therapy that's appropriate for them and can begin to do the hard work that they need to do.
Oh, it's a long journey. If you have to re-find yourself, that's because you really got to get down to the depths. You're not going to get anywhere better until you face it all.
That's right.
And you got to do that in small increments to take it all in.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah.
What kind of treatments are there?
I'll talk about that a little bit. So I'm not an expert on treatments, but I can give some generalizations. That first of all, there's no magic bullet medication. That there is no medication for DID. However, some people with DID may take an antidepressant or an anti-anxiety pill, and that's fine. But that's to address specific symptoms. There's nothing to address the symptoms that we experience with DID. In fact, there are uneducated professionals who have at times medicated people with DID in order to quiet their parts, which is a terrible thing to do and does not lead towards healing at all.
And it's depressing.
It is depressing, but when a
suppressing.
professional doesn't know what this means, they want to alleviate suffering. So they think if we quiet this part, that it'll be better. And it's maybe well-meaning stupidity, but the main form of therapeutic treatment is talk therapy with a therapist who has some knowledge of or experience with dissociative disorders and trauma. Just because they say they're trauma informed does not mean they have worked with people with dissociative disorders. And so the main, for me personally, and from what I understand for most people with DID, the main part of therapy is getting to know your parts and then helping your parts to get to know each other. And then eventually the more parts that you have contact with and that have contact with each other, then your amnesic walls begin to lower. And then everybody begins to know what everybody else knows, so that you become a whole person with parts, who you all know one another. I just want to say that my own therapist, what she would do when a new part would come out in the therapy room, every single time she would say, "Welcome. I'm so glad you're here, and I hope you come back again." And that was regardless of the character or trait of the part. So some of my parts were really angry and filled with rage, and that did not frighten her. She eventually would explain to them that they were hurt children. And then that was like she would take all the air out of their anger, like they're a balloon and she sticks a pin in it, to tell us that we were hurt children. It's like, they'd realize they are, I am a hurt child, even though right now I'm a teenager, or right now I'm an adult and I'm really angry and I'm ready to, scream and yell and rage. We're all hurt children, and our parts protected us. They saved our lives, even when they may have some challenging personality traits, and some of them certainly do. But what we end up doing as people with DID is we end up parenting our parts. They weren't parented the way they should have been as children. So I'm the adult, and I now can keep these little parts safe, even when they are miserable and mean. And then I also teach them how to not be miserable and mean. I mean, that takes a long time. I'm not even sure how you teach them that, but you just love them, right? You love them regardless. So it takes a long, long time, but that is basically the therapy that most people with DID engage in effectively. There are some other very specific modalities that might be helpful. So, for instance, EMDR is, I've never had EMDR, but I know people who have really raved about it. And I know someone who has a dissociative disorder, but not DID, and she finds it really, really helpful. And I have heard that for people with DID, there may be some challenges with it, but it's certainly something to look into. And the other is family system. Oh, wait a minute, what's it called? It's inner parts therapy, and I can't remember the name of it. But you don't have to have DID for it, but there's a whole system for how you look at yourself as being someone with parts. The only issue with that for DID is that we already have the parts. We don't have to sort of start from scratch with that. But I do understand that some therapists who have had experience with DID have been able to use it very well. So, I mean, there's probably other things that I don't know about. But the bedrock bottom line for therapy for people with DID is talk therapy with a therapist who's willing to work with your parts to discover your story and to help you through out your recovery. Now, I would also say that therapist, not only does that therapist work with parts, but also, we are people who have issues with attachment, issues with relationships, with trust. So there's always a lot of work to be done in the area of trust. And I think there's also a lot of work to be done in the area of grieving, because the fantasy life that we thought we had didn't exist. And so we have to grieve that loss so that we can go on and receive the new life that we create for ourselves. So I think those are some of the main components of therapeutic work. And I have already described to you that I am integrated, and what that means, or at least how I understand that to mean. There are some folks with DID who do all the other work that you work on with, childhood abuse and relationship issues and so on and so forth. But they do all the parts work too. But as parts, they choose to stay separate instead of integrated. So that's a valid choice too. That we call that functional multiplicity. That's not what I chose, but others may choose that.
But you still wouldn't have that memory then, right?
No, you would. Functional multiplicity would mean that that your parts have shared all of that the amnesic barriers have come down, and the parts have shared with you and each other, what their story is, what happened to them. So they all know about each other, but rather than relinquishing their personhood inside of you, they hold on to it. And some people say they would be lonely if their parts left. And, so I don't experience it that way, and I can't really speak for it or against it. I just know that that you can get to a point where you are functional. You can live a good life, but you allow your parts to continue to, or your, I don't know if allow is the right word, but your parts decide to become to remain separate from one another. So you'll have to invite somebody else on to your podcast to talk about that, because I really can't give anything specific. I operate as one person as often as I can, which is most of the time. Yeah.
It's a lot easier that way.
I find that to be true. Absolutely. Yeah.
So who names the parts? Is that something you come up with, or do they tell you what their name is? How does that come about?
Well, I think that's a good question, because I've actually seen people on chat group or DID chat groups ask the same question. And so in my case, I don't know. They came up with them themselves. I didn't name them. Okay. But I think other people do name their parts, because sometimes their parts come to them without names. So I think that's probably individual, but my parts had names when they came forward. So
I see. Did you have any hidden talent that you didn't know that you had when with your part?
Well, probably not. I wish I was a musician. I'm not. I wish I was an artist. I'm not. I am a writer, but I'm not sure that was hidden. I think that was pretty well integrated into my system, my total self, and it has grown and developed over the years. So, but I will say that parts can have different roles and functions. And so sometimes our parts hold emotions, and sometimes they hold skills, and sometimes they hold talents. And so you use the word hidden, so I can't affirm that in me, but I certainly, my parts certainly did have different roles and functions and talents. And, I have at least, I have several protector parts whose roles are to protect me. I have, I had a part, I have a part who held the shame, and that was a huge load to bear alone. And I had twins, a male and a female teenagers, one who held the sexuality and one who held the anger. The boy held the anger and the girl held the sexuality. And the sexuality, actually, I really had lost, until she came back out again. I was like, woo, okay.
Where have you been?
I had a part. I had a part who mothered my children, and then she disappeared because danger was happening in our family. And so that I've already alluded to that, and that made it very difficult in my parenting. I had a part who was the consummate professional, and she was able to administrate, she was able to juggle many pieces at a time. I had a part who had several small children, but in the early work that I did, Rosie was a 3-year-old child who was in the center of my system, and then Nanny held Rosie's abuse, so Rosie could go back and trust again. And so Nanny was withered and exhausted and miserable. I had, I should keep a list right in front of me, but I don't. But I had many different parts for many different functions or talents, and they were all very separate, for a long time. But then they all came together, and that just didn't disappear. That's all a part of me. So I've taught Mike, my angry part, how to manage his rage, and he actually has been very instrumental in helping me heal, because good anger can move you forward. So I still have that good anger, and I know how to use it without hurting other people. And his twin Sylvia held the sexuality, and I still, have a very profound, sexual identity. I love children, and that came from Laura, and I am a good administrator, and that's Paula, and so on and so forth. All of these parts are still manifest in me. They just don't exist in separate states.
Gotcha. Yeah, I actually have a list of them. I was looking over it. I like the Black Knight. He chops off people's heads.
Yeah, he's kind of gone underground because we don't do that anymore. But that was a protective mechanism, that if he sensed danger, he just that's it. No more. Sorry, the relationship's over. Yeah.
You are the weakest link. Goodbye. Very interesting. Very, very interesting. Would you say your journey to healing took probably at least a good 10, 15 years to be totally where you are? Or do you think it took more than that, or it was less than that?
Well, so I call it a 20-year journey, but I think it's really a lifelong journey, because even now I do work, So I was decompensating for 10 years, and I integrated after 10 years of deep work. Many people have to do deep work for a lot longer than that before they integrate. So I really hate to hold that out as a goal for people, because everybody's system is going to work differently on this. So that would have been so I'm 75 years old now, and that would have been from 35 to 55. But to be frank, so from 55 to 75, which I am now, it's 20 years. I've learned is when I've learned how to live my life, and created a really fine life for myself. But that has not been without challenges and not been without work, because I think we're healing until we die. In publishing my memoir, the writing of my memoir was not triggering for me at all. I was a good 20 years away from all that, and it gave me the distance I needed. But the publication of it did, because it created some really difficult waves in my family that I had not anticipated and absolutely did not want, and it tore me apart. So I published at the beginning of this year, and so I've actually been here's the one upside of the pandemic is we have telehealth now, right? And so my therapist from years of old and I have been working this year, and I haven't worked with her in decades, but we've been working this year quite regularly because part of my system came apart again, and I met some new alters. So I thought I was all done and all integrated, and the reality was that I wasn't, because what had happened in my family began to mimic what had happened as a child, and so all that opened up again. But I'd like to say that I'm back on an even keel. I hope I am. But I know what to do if I'm not, I just have to live longer than my therapist. That's all. Yeah. But I've actually gone decades without regular therapy. I mean, I've had different therapists to touch base with on certain things, and that's been great. But this year I have done regular weekly therapy with the same person. So, but we've done some good triage, and I think that things are much more stable now. So,
well, that's good. I'm sorry about the issues that it arose, but you had to let your truth out, and you shouldn't be ashamed for that. So,
right. Well, and I'm not ashamed. I'm not ashamed, but it's dealing with the people we love,
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, healing is a life journey. There's no quick fix. There's no abracadabra. It doesn't matter what you're trying to heal from, all of it. It's a lifetime. It could be addiction. It could be anything, everything that you have to work on yourself. It's lifelong, but it's so worth it.
Yes, it is so worth it. And so if you'd like me to, I can just tell you a little bit about what I'm doing now that might be interesting or of help to your listeners.
Absolutely.
I have two websites, actually. I have one website, which is www.lynbarrett.com. And that's Lyn, Lyn, Barrett, BARRETT.com. On that, there's quite a bit on that, but my weekly blog is there, published there, and people can sign up for the weekly newsletter if they'd like it. I have a free ebook that people can download called DID Unpacked. And there's a little bit of my story, my resume, so to speak. People can find out more about me on that. And I have a little video that was made to promote the memoir. And then I also have a website called www.dissociativewriters.com. And I founded a group for people who have dissociative disorders who write or who want to write. And so we offer writers' workshops every week. So there's one a week. And we also have one social hangout a month so people can get to know each other better. And we also publish an annual anthology of writing from writers, dissociative writers. And we have spoken at conferences. And so people who have an interest in writing and believe they have a dissociative disorder might want to take a look at that website to see what it's all about. And we would be happy to have you join us if you have an interest in that. We found that our writers' workshops are very, very powerful for people. They are not therapy groups. And yet there is healing that happens because for the first time, you actually can have a community of people that understand what your story is, and people who you can trust and start to bond with. And at the same time, you are developing your writing and your writing skills. So people can write poetry, they write prose. Most of them are writing from their backgrounds and experiences, which is really a memoir type of writing. But we have had people who've brought in some fiction too, so that's also fine. So encourage people to check out both of those websites and see what's out there that might be supportive to you.
Absolutely. To feel like people understand you, that is so important. And
Yes.
everybody needs to feel like they belong somewhere.
Yes.
Where can they find a copy of Crazy if somebody would like to buy the book?
Absolutely. They can find it on really any online bookstore. The best sales are on Amazon.com. So if that's important to you, go to Amazon. But Barnes and Noble carries it, and I don't even know the names of all the others, but they all carry it. So that would be the place to get it. Would be your favorite online bookstore, or you can go to my website and that will take you directly to the Amazon. There's a place where you can click for the book, and it'll take you to the Amazon site.
Great. And I will actually add that into the bottom of my description. So anyone who is interested can just click on that link and then we'll find your book.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. I really enjoyed having you on. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you have a great night.
I thank you very much, and I hope you have a great night too, and the same to all of your listeners.
Check the links in the description if you are interested. You will also find my links down there, and they're on the bottom of every episode. Make sure to like, follow, subscribe, leave a 5-star review. Come find me on Instagram. And I just want to say thank you. I've had such a great outpouring from my video. That was scary as shit. And I just want to say thank you to all the people who actually really appreciated it. So that meant a lot to me. All right, you guys, we'll talk crime another time. Bye.